Hello, I'm Keith Spera from NOLA.com and the Times-Picayune. Welcome to Let's Talk. Armed with a small but mighty baton, my guest today leads one of the biggest bands in town. He is in his inaugural season as the music director and principal conductor of the Louisiana Philharmonic Orchestra, the oldest full-time musician-governed orchestra in the country. He's also an accomplished violinist. It's my pleasure to welcome Matthew Kraemer. Matthew.
It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Thank you for being here. Do I need to call you Maestro or anything like that?
Not at all. It's that Seinfeld episode that everybody knows. No, I prefer Matt or Matthews.
Matt or Matthews, okay, all right. So I gotta say, you made your debut with the orchestra a little while ago at the Orpheum, sold-out show at the Orpheum, which seemed like a great way to kick off your tenure here. One of my favorite moments had nothing to do with music necessarily. It was during the performance of Beethoven's Fifth, and I guess between movements, people traditionally don't clap, but one gentleman felt moved to applaud, and you kind of did one of these, you kind of gave a little head nod over your shoulder to acknowledge that one lone applause. So, A, why is that? Why don't people applaud between movements? It just seems kind of weird.
It's a fascinating construct, really, of the 19th century. You know, the idea that we have of a stuffy, buttoned-up concert experience is not how it used to be. This evolved because of high society conductors like Mahler, who treated the concert hall like a temple or a place of worship, and that you had to respect the composer's intention and pure silence, and any coughing is frowned upon. But I want to go back to Beethoven and Berlioz's time, where there were like fire eaters between movements. They would improvise for movement. As the audience were clapping uncontrollably, they would encore movements on the spot. So I look at it that way. If the audience is telling us that they appreciated what they heard, I love it.
Well, to me, it's got to be weird to, like, you play this piece and, like I said, and then you guys reset for the next movement and it's silence. That seems like that just seems unnatural to me.
It does in many respects. Now, I can see both sides as most things, that people do want to respect the tradition that has been cultivated over 100 years, et cetera. You know, but there's the other part of the spontaneity, which I do appreciate, that people are living in the moment. This is not a recording. This is not on television. This is something that's happening in real time. And that's the difference between listening to your perfect stereo system at home and coming to a live concert, is that the music is breathing. It's actually alive at that moment. Otherwise, it's black dots on a page. But when the musicians breathe, every performance is different. It's stretching of tempo here, pushing here. Everything will come out on the clock, either slightly slower or slightly faster than the previous night. So that's the way I look at it. We're living in the moment.
Absolutely. And when you're working with a piece of sheet music, obviously it's going to follow a certain form, but the, I guess, art in it, and especially with what you do as conductor, is to find ways to put your own interpretation in there, to, I don't know if improvise is maybe too strong a word, but to put these little twists in it that make it a live performance, I guess.
Absolutely. You know, we learn a lot as musicians, as artists, fidelity to the score, the composer's intentions. It's down there. Do what he said. Don't go faster or slower than he or she said. But there are so many decisions that we make on a daily basis that we're not even aware of. And I think the same is true for how we approach music making. That, you know, even a subtle push here, again, as I mentioned, is time, you know, that you can delay slightly. I liken it to how we read stories. Some people are great orators, and they can keep us captivated by the tone of their voice or the speed in which they recite. And we do the same in music. I mean, the idea of the intensity which we apply at a specific moment can radiate through the entire duration of the work. So there are myriad decisions that have to be made, and that's why there are 500 recordings of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony out there.
No two alike.
No two alike.
No two alike. Well, and you've kind of answered this, and I think, you know, this is a public TV station, so I'm going to assume a lot of people watching it are very familiar with how an orchestra works and what a conductor does. But explain exactly, in a nutshell, what your role is up there. Like, what are you trying to do? Like, and in other words, could they do it without you? Could they just read the sheet music and play the piece without a conductor up there?
Oh, absolutely. In many respects. There are conductorless ensembles. I'm thinking of Orpheus Chamber Orchestra, for example. Many orchestras have specific concerts that are led by their concertmaster. But there's always somebody leading, whether it's the first chair, first violin, or the person that sits at the keyboard that does it, or they rehearse so well together that they come up with a unified interpretation. So there's always decisions that have to be made. Somebody has to make it. But the idea for a conductor really started around Beethoven's time and then continued on as the ensembles got so big that communicating across large spaces from the back of the first violins all the way over to the tuba, for example, became difficult. And there were so many meter changes, there's so many tempo changes that really, if you think of it as a traffic cop up there directing traffic, or, it really is a very complex job because you have to create an atmosphere where the musicians feel they can give their very best performance. But as the magic really happens during the rehearsal period. That's when the decisions are made. You're fixing things, either ensemble or articulation or intonation or whatever the case. Balances are always issues. Who's too loud, who's too soft.
Sure.
So there's a lot of the micromanaging in that aspect of it. And there's a huge component that I'm still trying to figure out, and as a conductor, this kind of black magic, the psychology part of it, how to compel people without actually asking them to do things, or correcting them without actually correcting them. These kinds of things are very challenging for anybody in social scenarios, but in this case I'm standing in front of 70 incredibly talented and well-qualified artists. So it's a very delicate dance to be a conductor, and I think that's why we have longevity, to be able to do this like Herbert Blumstedt at 92 years old. I mean, if I were a linebacker, I wouldn't be playing that long.
No,
so
sir.
I appreciate that aspect of this career.
So a lot of the work gets done in the rehearsal, so really the performance is just your time to show off.
That's one way of looking at it, I suppose. Yeah. Sometimes it feels like that way. Sometimes it feels like, depending on the repertoire, the rehearsals might have been so intense and thorough that you just kind of go out there and you just play it.
Right.
There are other times that you can really kind of live in the moment and do things a little bit differently in the concert because you have the trust of the musicians, or you feel like there's a connection here. So, especially when we repeat performances, we have it, for example, a concert that we might have played one night, we might take to another location another night. And sometimes it's with intent that I try to change things up a little bit, just to live in the moment again.
Well, and based on the setting, I mean, you may do a little bit different performance outside of a concert hall than you would in. I mean, all that sort of thing.
That's absolutely right. Acoustics are a big thing. If we were to take something from a concert hall to a church where it's much more reverberant, then maybe we need a little more space and time in there to let the music kind of stretch.
Your bio refers to your, and I want to say it right, your energized sense of interpretation.
I think editor put that in somewhere.
But actually, I mean, to me that just means you get into it. You put your shoulders into it. You're moving. You're not just standing up there like you're feeling the music. You're kind of riding with the music as well. Is that safe to say?
I believe so. Yeah. Again, there's 350, 400 years of music. There's so many different styles and kinds and genres that some things really I have a deep connection with, but that always seems to change. The next year I'll feel more compelled by a different composer. But I think that when it connects with you, it imparts upon you some kind of vigor, attachment, electricity, whatever the case may be. And I think when you don't feel that, then there's something to worry about at that point.
Well, yeah, and you want to engage an audience. I mean, you want to, and you want to keep renewing that audience. You want to bring new people into the music and what have you. So it's important to not be too stiff up there. I
agree completely with that. That's we talk about that a lot. And the conductors, the old maestros who are up there, and they just, like Fritz Reiner or Richard Strauss was famous. He would conduct with his finger. In the left hand, he would look at his pocket watch and put it back in his pocket. And
well, you don't want to go over time. I mean, if you're on the clock,
his mind was already on the meal afterwards.
Exactly.
I'm convinced. But these conductors were able to elicit extraordinary sounds. But I think the fact is, especially in this day and age, we do listen with our eyes too. And to see animated performers up there, whether they're violinists with their scroll up in the air and looking triumphantly to the heavens, and every artist has their own kind of demeanor when they're on stage, and certainly the music has something to do with that, whatever the piece may be. But I believe in putting yourself into it, your corporal self as well as your intellect and your heart. I mean, all of that is kind of combined.
Well, and it's just the same is true for pop artists. You have to sell the performance to a certain degree. I mean, yes, the music speaks for itself, but again, it's not a recording. I mean, this is supposed to be human beings rendering this music and engaging with the human beings in the audience.
That's absolutely right, and I think we learned something from popular artists, that they are able to engage a very large audience just as much from their charisma, sometimes as much as their music that they actually make.
And the LPO has kind of dipped their toe in those waters. I mean, more and more it seems recently. I mean, Big Frida did a show last year, and I think Tank and the Bangas. So they're engaging with some of the local pop artists. They've done interpretations of I think Led Zeppelin music and all these sorts of things. So that to you, are those good things for the orchestra to be doing?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that this is a mistake, frankly, that orchestras had made quite a while ago, where they became very exclusive clubs, basically, for people who wanted their core repertoire which is what our foundation is built on. So that's not to say that that's going anywhere, but we can do a lot more. We can engage our community in a variety of programs, and I think specific to a city like New Orleans, which is unlike anywhere else in the world, that the amount of artists, musicians that have come out of this city, and there are those artists present here developing early in their career. The LPO can be very supportive of the young artists as well as very well-established artists here and bring them into our family. We can reach out to their family and do concerts in really untraditional settings, which, as you pointed out, has been tremendously successful for us. We're featured on CBS National News for our Big Frida performance. We're releasing an album with Lost Bayou Ramblers that was recorded. We have some really exciting endeavors coming up, which we're going to be announcing soon. So for the audience members who say, I like my Mozart and Beethoven, then I could point through our season brochure. Well, there it is. That's not going anywhere. But look what the exposure has given us in this realm as well.
Well, your very first performance with the LPO, you did Beethoven's Fifth, which is, one of the greatest hits of classical music, obviously.
Yes.
But you opened the program with Songs of Orpheus, which is a brand new commission at the LPO. So I don't know, were you involved in programming that show? So
Absolutely.
The fact that the first song of or first performance of the first piece of your first performance was a brand new composition. There's a message there. I mean,
absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm glad that you mentioned that, because there is. I believe fervently in new music, because Beethoven, as we say, was new at one time too. And in this case, Stacey Garup is a composer that I've worked with many times, and she's a phenomenal composer, a storyteller really with music. So immediately I thought of Stacey. We reached out, and she was in between a huge work that she wrote for the Pittsburgh Symphony and 2 operas, which she's about to begin. So there was this small window which we just inserted ourselves. She took the invitation graciously and contributed a piece, a 7-minute work that I think a lot of people were talking about, because it was new and it was written specifically for our home, the Orpheum, and premiered by the LPO. So I think that there is incredible new music out there. But again, new music for some people, it's kind of a scary category, because there is some new music that is really kind of challenging. But there are so many tastes out there. I find there's a great deal of lyricism and melody with the composers that I'm drawn to who are alive, and those are the composers I look forward to working with in the future.
Some composers that have a little bit of classicness to them. I mean, references to the old stuff, but
that's
in
right.
a fresh way. Yeah. Because I mean, her piece did not seem radical by any sense of imagination.
No, very creative, but certainly not alienated.
Right. And it was partly intended as a tribute to some of the founding members of the LPO that are still in the orchestra.
That's exactly right. I mean, this story is very well known in the orchestra circles of what happened here over 30 years ago, and there are still 5 founding members in the orchestra now. So she was able to incorporate 5 specific solos in her piece for those members.
Is that one of the things that drew you to take this job? Because you're coming from Indianapolis, where you were the associate conductor of the chamber orchestra up there, or
the music director.
Music director of the chamber, and still working with those guys as well.
Exactly.
So what was it about the LPO that drew you to take this gig?
Well, the fact that I had conducted them twice in 2 very different settings, and I found them. I knew several of the musicians personally from either previous orchestra experiences or in other locations, and so I knew if the orchestra were anything like the individuals that I knew already, then it was going to be a terrific group of people. And when it came down to conduct, they were very gracious. They were very kind, and that's not always the case. We conductors get beat up sometimes when we're standing in front of an orchestra, which we don't know. They would put us through our paces, and we deserve that. And in this case, came down and just had none of that experience. It was all, do we mind if we do this again, or could we? There was a kind of a sense of collaboration there, and I really enjoyed the rehearsal process. The second time I was down here, obviously, was much different, because that was, by the way, we're going to attach some interviews to your week, which ended up being kind of 9 to 5 wall-to-wall coffee appointments and interviews with this. So it was, I knew that they were looking at me seriously since Maestro Prieto was moving on. But still came away with the musical experience being very, very positive. And throughout that whole interview process, I just really felt like everybody's heart was in the right place. They believed in this orchestra, the construct of it being musician owned and collaboratively governed. It was, I had known about this, and it was the model for other orchestras that have kind of followed suit after disastrous bankruptcies. So everything kind of pointed me in the right direction with this, and I do believe in that. Like, I don't know if there was a specific sign, but it really felt like it was the place for me. I felt like right now at my age in my career, I have the best years ahead of me to dedicate to an orchestra. I'm very proud of the work I've done in the other posts that I've held, but I felt like I could give 100% over here and really really help move the needle for this marvelous orchestra.
And this is, I guess, a step up for you. I mean, this is the first time you've been a full music director and principal conductor for an orchestra this large? I mean,
for a full-time symphony orchestra, yes. I was associate conductor for Joanne Folletta in Virginia, and then 5 years with the Buffalo Philharmonic. So I've certainly worked within the apparatus of a 42-week season orchestra before, and those experiences, thankfully for me, gave me experience across the board, from classical to pops, education, opera, rock, you name it. But this is the first appointment. Held post with several regional orchestras, continuing with the chamber orchestra, which has about 12-week season. But first time here with a 36-week season orchestra and all of the myriad responsibilities that go along with it.
Going back to what you said a second ago, how exactly does an orchestra beat up on a conductor? What does that consist of?
Sometimes it's subtle, sometimes it's really kind of obvious. In some cases, it's just they're testing you out. You know, they're seeing what kind of person you are, whether you respond to the antagonism or whether you're cool and collected. So I like to think of myself as the latter. I remember one experience, and this is an orchestra where I've gone back to now for 14 years since then. Every year, the one musician kept asking me if we were going to take the repeats. Are we going to take the repeats?
Take the repeats.
Take the repeats, meaning we get to a certain point in the music, it's written in to go back and play a passage over again. And we always, I'll tell you, it was the national anthem. I mean, you take the repeat in the national anthem, you go back and sing, and then it went on, it was a medley of something. So after the third time he asked the question, I said, well, you always take that repeat in the national anthem, as the lyrics line up that way. So I could tell what he was getting at, but just those kind of little subtle things, like I asked you this question, ask you again, or sometimes they talk a little bit when you're trying to talk to them. Most of the time I've had very positive experiences, but I have horror stories from colleagues who didn't get invited back to guest conducting appearances.
So it's more mental games, unlike, say, like the brothers in Oasis throwing beer bottles at each other. It's not that kind of beating up that we're talking about.
We still have protocol. There are still rules of decorum that can't be crossed. But yes, it is sometimes very subtle. But like I said, you know, if you kind of pass the test, if they trust you, then chances are you'll be invited back. And many of my experiences have been very positive after this.
Okay, all right. What kind of started you on the road to classical music? Was there a watershed moment? I mean, you must have taken violin lessons as a kid, obviously. But what really sparked your interest in going down?
It was my older brother, and I tell this story a lot because I think it can also represent how really anybody can find their way to any career, sometimes by accident. In my case, my older brother came home 10 years older than me and had signed me up for violin lessons.
Your brother signed you up?
My brother did. He's very artistic, literary, worked at Juilliard for 15 years, playwright. And so coming from a non-musical family, he thought it was about time somebody learned a musical instrument, but he didn't want to do it because he had tried clarinet and he was terrible at it and didn't want to practice. So here I am, the youngest Kraemer son. Now it's my obligation to forge this path into music, and I don't know, I can't say that I immediately fell in love with it, but my teacher was wonderful. Her name was Carolyn Klemperer, and her relation, the great uncle, I think, was Otto Klemperer, the German conductor, and Werner Klemperer, who was on Hogan's Heroes. So there was some, how she ended up in a small Midwestern farm town, I don't know. But you know, after a while, I just appreciated the challenge of it, that the pieces were hard, but then, you know, you progress and you go back to the piece and it's easy. So you kind of really a sense of, you know, progress can be gauged very easily learning a musical instrument and all the frustrations that come with it. But I think it's when I got to orchestra and I got to meet other people who were doing it, and the idea of this community of people working together. And then probably high school I fell in love with it, decided that's what I wanted to pursue after that, and you know, then every door that opened kind of led to another door.
Is that a good way to meet girls, playing violin? I mean, is that in high school? Did that help you out in high school?
I think the football stars and basketball stars were probably a little bit more successful at that. But no, I was known as the music guy in my school. Richmond, Indiana actually is fascinating. A lot of classical musicians have come from there. Jack Everly is one of the preeminent pops conductors. Matt Vaughn plays principal trombone in the Philadelphia Orchestra. There's kind of a list of people who've gone off to. Ned Rorem, the American composer, was from Richmond. In my experience, it was just kind of like a novelty. Matt plays the fiddle, so it wasn't
Matt plays the fiddle.
Yeah.
A little bluegrass, playing a little bluegrass.
I had to learn. Devil went down to Georgia just to appease a lot of people.
Did you really?
Yeah, absolutely. That's my calling card at cocktail hour.
Devil went down to Georgia. One of the great fiddle tunes of all time.
Absolutely is.
Well, I mean, with your violin skills, do you think you could hold down the first chair in the LPO?
Oh, not at this point in my career. But, you know, it's interesting. There are 4 of us in the LPO that actually studied at the same graduate program. And it's not one that I think many people are aware of out west, University of Nevada, Reno. Philip Reuter was the concertmaster of the New Orleans Symphony ages ago. Then he went to Dallas Symphony, and then 25 years as concertmaster of the Cincinnati Symphony. He got tired of the orchestra business, went out to Reno and started a studio for orchestral career studies. The idea is you come in as a string player and you learn not concertos or sonatas, you did that too, but the idea was to focus on orchestral repertoire so you could be ready for an audition. And the fact that there are 4 of us that went through his program here, he only took 1 student or 2 students in his studio a year for this, that 4 of us ended up here is fascinating. So at that point in my early 20s, I decided I was either going to be a violinist or a conductor, whatever audition I won first, that's what I would do. Turned out that my first audition was a conducting audition. Otherwise, I could be in the orchestra.
And you could be in the orchestra. All right. One of the interesting things that you did along the way was that you were the symphonic concert director for the Real Life Elsa for a bit, Idina Menzel.
That's right.
So you conducted, when she performed songs from, was she doing Frozen songs and
she
stuff?
She did a whole catalog of repertoire, and then Frozen came in right about halfway through, so she had inserted, and it's funny because her audience completely changed at that moment. She went from the 20s, 30s Broadway crowd to all of a sudden little girls dressed up in dresses in the audience.
So you were conducting for little girls in princess dresses,
exactly.
Frozen dresses, and Elsa dresses. Oh, that's funny. Just real quickly, I mean, with her, what struck you about working with her? What was, I don't know, how did she interact with the orchestra in an orchestra environment?
Oh, she was so genuine, so real, so electric. I mean, she has charisma. And so the short story is that I was conducting the Jacksonville Symphony in a series of concerts. The general manager asked me if I'd be interested in doing this kind of one-off show with Idina Menzel, and I'm not even sure I entirely knew who she was. I knew the name, Broadway, etc., but she was just coming off of, Wicked had already closed. It was in touring production with other actresses, and so she was looking for this next project after having a child, and she wanted to do symphony engagements because Kristen Chenoweth had started doing symphony engagements. She had a musical director that wrote these charts for her, so she was going to do a trial run in Jacksonville because she didn't want to do it in New York. Right. She didn't want to do it in Boston, Jacksonville.
Jacksonville, yeah.
So she had never worked with an orchestra before, and so she didn't know about the decorum, the procedures and all of this, and so she went out there as genuine can be to the audience. We had some really buttoned up symphony goers out there, and she had some very colorful language that she was sharing with her charisma, and the Broadway crowd was laughing hysterically, and then others in the orchestra were like, all right. So, I had to kind of pull her aside afterwards. I said, Idina, you were brilliant, but just to be aware of the gasps that you were hearing, probably from a more conservative audience base, and from there it just went off to so many different cities. She appreciated working with me. I had a lot of opera and Broadway experience, and my back was turned to her the whole time because she was upstaged. So I was able to just trust her. She trusted me, and then that led to kind of an extensive 1-year period. I was still with the Buffalo Philharmonic then, so whenever I could get off contract dates, I was always with her.
That's awesome. Were your sons impressed at all that you worked with the woman at Voices, Elsa in Frozen?
I'll be honest, I don't think my sons are impressed at all with what I do. The anecdote that I always share, my oldest son, who's 11 now, has been a train enthusiast his entire life. He loves locomotives, Thomas the Train, Lydell now, and we had a family friend come over, and he was dressed up in his train outfit, and what do you want to be when you grow up, Gabe? He goes, I want to be a conductor. And they said, oh, wonderful, just like your father. And he said, no, a real conductor.
A train conductor?
Yep. And then my youngest son, he said he was mad at me for some reason, and then he stormed off. And my youngest has a way of kind of just getting under the skin. Instead of saying, I hate you or I'm mad at you, he said, and no one likes your stupid concerts either.
Oh,
that
ouch.
Bites. That cuts deep.
Ouch.
So to answer your question, my kids come to my concerts, and I don't really think that they play piano. We have them in that, but I don't know if they're particularly impressed with seeing Daddy up there waving his arms around. They think I'm interpretive dancing, basically, most of the time.
Which you kind of are.
Which is kind of true. That's right. The musicians are the ones who are making the sound.
Speaking of interpretive dancing, you have your baton here.
That's right.
It is a very delicate. It's more delicate than I thought these things are. I mean, you have to be careful. What is it made out of? Is it?
This one is so that's cork handle there, and absolutely plexiglass. They make them.
Plexiglass.
Yeah. So that way, you hit the stand or you drop it by accident. It stays together. I've broken so many different wood ones over the career, but that's kind of what I've settled on. It sits in the base of your hand, and you're very nimble. You can move it with your fingers. You can hold it with a fist.
It's got nice balance.
Yeah.
Yep. And it could double as a straw. It's hollow, right?
Get 2 of them and you can eat sushi with it.
Exactly.
The story is, that the French composer Lully in the Baroque period, they used to hold rods and bang them on the floor to keep pulse for the orchestra, but Lully stabbed himself in the foot, contracted gangrene, and died. And
he died for his art?
That's the story. He died from gangrene from stabbing his foot. So then the baton was created by Louis Spera, and we've used these ever since.
Wow. Do you have a specific kind that you're fond of?
I actually have a whole assortment of batons. I kind of collect them. They're very inexpensive compared to French bows or Italian violins. I mean, these things run $30, $40. So I've got German batons. This is a Japanese maker that makes these. There are handcrafted makers here too. So it's really very specific. Every conductor kind of falls to the baton that fits their hand best.
Does your wife roll her eyes like, oh gosh, another baton?
Another one showed up. I think she's more concerned about the suits and the clothes that show up here, the shopping addiction that I've developed since COVID. But no, the baton, she doesn't really mind those because those are
a tool of the trade.
A tool of the trade. I can write them off.
You can write them off. Well, but also, I mean, your tuxedo with the tails, you can probably write that off as well.
Oh, exactly. That's what I mean. You're always kind of inserting new things into the wardrobe because we're up there on stage. We have to represent ourselves well.
Well, you got to look sharp, I mean, that's part of the gig. You're selling it. Well, no, this has been great. I look forward to seeing where you take the orchestra going forward. It seems like, you're very enthused about this position and ready to lead it into its next era. So I look forward to seeing where that goes.
I appreciate that very much. Thank you.
And hopefully they won't beat you up too badly.
They've been good to me so far.
Great. Very good. Well, Matthew, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, Keith.
Thank you guys for watching. Once again, I am Keith Spera. This has been Let's Talk. We'll see you next week.